On a quiet Sunday evening in December 9th, 2007, the kind of calm that usually settles over suburban Texas was suddenly and violently broken. In the city of North Richland Hills, a place known for its peaceful neighborhoods and close-knit community, nothing about that night seemed out of the ordinary, at least not at first. Inside a home on Spence Court, a married couple was doing what so many families across Texas were doing that evening, relaxing at home, watching football, and winding down the weekend. It was a routine night, predictable and comfortable. There were no signs of danger, no warnings, no reason to believe that anything was about to go terribly wrong. Then, at around 8 o'clock in the evening, everything changed. A sudden knock came at the front door. It wasn't expected. In a quiet cul-de-sac, especially on a Sunday night, unannounced visitors were rare. But it wasn't alarming enough to raise immediate concern. It was just a knock, something simple, ordinary, and familiar. A 68-year-old grandmother named Marianne Wilkinson walked toward the door. What happened next unfolded in mere seconds, but it would leave behind questions that have lasted for years. As soon as the door opened, gunfire erupted. The violence was immediate, precise, and shockingly brief. There was no struggle, no warning, no conversation. Just a sudden burst of gunshots that shattered the silence of the neighborhood. Inside the home, her husband heard the shots ring out. Sharp, unmistakable, and completely out of place in a neighborhood like theirs. He rushed toward the front of the house. What he found was a scene no one has ever prepared for. Marianne had collapsed near the doorway. The person responsible was already gone, vanishing into the night just as quickly as they had arrived. Within moments, a desperate call to emergency services was made. The voice on the other end of the line carried panic, confusion, and disbelief. This wasn't something that was supposed to happen here. Not in this neighborhood. Not to someone like Marianne Wilkinson. Outside, neighbors began to react. Some reported hearing multiple gunshots, sharp sounds that echoed through the quiet streets. Others noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere as emergency vehicles began arriving, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Police and first responders rushed to the scene, but the damage had already been done. What they had in front of them was not just a tragedy, it was a mystery. There were no immediate answers, no clear suspect, no obvious motive. Just a quiet suburban home, a front door that had been opened at the wrong moment, and a crime that made no sense. And that was the most unsettling part of all. Because in cases like this, investigators usually start with a simple question: why? But here, that question didn't have an obvious answer. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing appeared to be taken. The attack had been quick, targeted, and deliberate, but against someone who, by all accounts, had no known enemies and no reason to be a target. It was as if the violence had come out of nowhere. And as the scene was secured and the investigation began, one chilling possibility started to take shape, one that would change the direction of the entire case. What if Marianne Wilkinson wasn't the intended target at all? That question wouldn't be fully understood until later, but from the very beginning, this case carried a feeling that something didn't add up. A quiet night, a single knock, and a crime that seemed completely out of place. As investigators began piecing together the first moments of what had happened, they quickly realized something even more disturbing. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was something far more calculated. Before her name became tied to one of the most unsettling cold cases in Texas, Marianne Wilkinson was known for something entirely different: kindness, creativity, and a life built around family, faith, and community. To understand the weight of what was lost on that December night in 2007, you have to understand the kind of person she was long before the headlines. Marianne was 68 years old, a devoted wife, a mother, and a grandmother who played a central role in her family's life. She wasn't someone who lived on the edges of her community. She was deeply rooted in it. Her days were filled with the kinds of quiet routines that often go unnoticed, but form the backbone of a meaningful life. She had a strong creative side. Painting was one of her passions, and her artwork wasn't just a hobby. It was part of how she expressed herself. Her family would later describe how her paintings filled their homes, leaving behind a lasting imprint of her personality and talent. Each piece reflected patience, care, and attention to detail. But her creativity didn't stop there. Marianne was also a certified master gardener, someone who found joy in transforming ordinary outdoor spaces into something vibrant and full of life. Where others might see an overgrown yard or a neglected patch of land, she saw potential. She enjoyed starting from scratch, building something beautiful step by step. It was a reflection of who she was at her core, someone who nurtured, improved, and cared deeply about the world around her. Her background also spoke to a life of stability and strong values. She grew up in Highland Park, Texas, an area known for its close-knit community and tradition. She later attended Southern Methodist University, continuing a path shaped by education, family support, and opportunity. These early experiences helped shape the person she became, someone grounded, thoughtful, and deeply connected to those around her. Family was always at the center of her world. Her marriage to her husband, Don, was described as close and enduring. They shared a life built on companionship and routine, the kind that develops over years of shared experiences. Together, they created a home that was not just a place to live, but a place that reflected warmth, comfort, and stability. To her children and grandchildren, Marianne was more than just a family member. She was a constant presence, someone who made ordinary moments feel special. Whether it was through small traditions, thoughtful gestures, or simply being there, she played a role that cannot easily be replaced. And that is what made the events of that night so difficult to comprehend. Because when investigators began looking into her life, searching for answers, they found nothing that pointed toward danger. No ongoing conflicts, no known threats, no hidden aspects of her life that suggested she could have been targeted. Everything about Marianne Wilkinson pointed in the opposite direction. She lived a quiet life. She was respected by those who knew her, and she had no known enemies. For investigators, this created an immediate and deeply troubling problem. In most cases, understanding the victim helps lead to a motive. It provides direction, a starting point, a reason behind the crime. But in this case, the more they learned about Marianne, the less sense the crime seemed to make. There was no clear reason why someone would come to her door that night with the intent to kill. And that absence of motive would become one of the most haunting aspects of the entire investigation. Because if Marianne Wilkinson wasn't the target, then who was? That question lingered as detectives began to widen their focus beyond the victim herself, looking not just at her life, but at everything surrounding it. The house, the neighborhood, the people living nearby. Somewhere in those details, they believed was the answer. As emergency responders cleared the immediate chaos on Spence Court, the focus quickly shifted from saving a life to understanding a crime. The front of the Wilkinson home became an active investigation site within minutes. Patrol officers secured the area, taping off the property, while detectives and crime scene investigators began documenting everything in careful detail. What they were looking for was simple in theory: anything that could explain who had come to that door and why. But almost immediately, something felt off. There were no signs of forced entry. The door had been opened willingly. That alone told investigators something important. Marianne had no reason to fear whoever was outside. She wasn't trying to keep someone out. She answered the door as if it were a normal visitor. Just as telling was what wasn't found inside the home. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been disturbed. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the doorway. This ruled out one of the most common explanations in cases like this: robbery. If someone had come there intending to steal, they never even attempted it. The attack had been immediate, focused entirely on the person who answered the door, and then it was over. Investigators began to consider the nature of the attack itself. The shooter had approached the front door, waited for it to open, and then fired multiple times before fleeing the scene. There was no attempt to enter the home afterward, no hesitation, no interaction that anyone could report. It was quick, controlled, and deliberate. That kind of approach suggested planning. This wasn't random behavior. It wasn't impulsive. Whoever had come to that house had arrived with a purpose and had left just as quickly once that purpose was carried out. Outside, detectives expanded their search. They canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with residents who had heard the gunshots or noticed anything unusual. A few neighbors reported hearing several shots in quick succession, but no one had a clear description of a suspect. There were no immediate eyewitnesses who could say who had been on that porch. The street itself offered little help. Spence Court was a quiet cul-de-sac, not a high-traffic area. That meant fewer potential witnesses, and fewer chances that someone passing by might have seen something important. At the time, home surveillance systems and doorbell cameras were not common, leaving investigators with very limited visual evidence to work with. They widened the search outward, checking nearby roads and intersections, hoping to find any sign of a vehicle leaving the area around the time of the shooting. But again, nothing concrete surfaced. It was as if the person responsible had appeared, carried out the act, and disappeared without leaving a trace behind. Still, the scene did produce physical evidence. Shell casings were recovered near the doorway. Small but critical pieces that could later be used for ballistic analysis. Investigators carefully collected them, knowing that even the smallest detail could become important as the case developed. But in those first hours, what stood out most wasn't what they had, it was what they didn't. No clear suspect, no immediate motive, no obvious connection between the victim and the attack. And that combination created a growing sense of unease among investigators. Because crimes like this usually fall into patterns. There is typically a relationship, a conflict, or a reason that begins to emerge early in the investigation. Here, there was only silence. As detectives continued to piece together the timeline of that evening, they realized they might need to look beyond the Wilkinson household entirely. If the answers weren't inside the home, then perhaps they were somewhere nearby. And then, a new piece of information came in. One that would shift the direction of the investigation in a way no one had expected. It didn't come from physical evidence. It came from someone living just a short distance away. And what this person told investigators would introduce a theory so unsettling it would redefine the entire case. In the early stages of the investigation, detectives were facing a case with no clear direction. The crime scene pointed to something deliberate, yet nothing in Marianne Wilkinson's life explained why she would be targeted. Then a new lead emerged, one that didn't come from forensic evidence, but from someone living nearby. A woman contacted investigators with a theory that immediately stood out. It wasn't just speculation. It was specific, detailed, and deeply personal. She believed the shooter had gone to the wrong house. According to her, she, not Marianne, may have been the intended target. At first, the idea sounded almost unbelievable, but as detectives began looking into it, the details started to align in a way that couldn't be ignored. The woman lived on a nearby street, just a short distance from the Wilkinson home. The two houses were not only close in proximity, they shared the exact same house number. In a neighborhood with similar layouts and quiet streets, it would not have been difficult for someone unfamiliar with the area to confuse one for the other, especially at night. That alone was enough to raise serious questions. But what made the theory even more compelling was what was happening in her personal life at the time. She was involved in a contentious divorce. This was not a simple separation. Reports indicated that the situation involved ongoing conflict and significant financial tension. There were disputes tied to shared business interests, and the relationship had reportedly become hostile. When investigators heard this, the case began to shift. Because now, for the first time, there was a possible motive, just not one connected to Marianne Wilkinson. If someone had wanted this woman harmed and had hired another person to carry it out, a simple mistake in identifying the correct house could have led directly to the wrong door. And if that happened, Marianne Wilkinson may have unknowingly answered a knock that was never meant for her. Detectives began to examine this theory seriously. They looked into the woman's estranged husband, Dennis Taylor, as a potential person of interest. Given the nature of the divorce and the financial stakes involved, investigators considered whether there could have been a motive tied to eliminating a spouse during a bitter separation. From there, the investigation expanded. 2 additional individuals came into focus: Vincent Lane and Willie Boley. Both were connected through associations that investigators believed could be relevant to the case. In particular, Willie Boley was believed to have worked for Dennis Taylor, which raised further questions about possible connections. At this stage, the case had transformed. What initially appeared to be a completely random and senseless act of violence was now being considered as something far more calculated, a potential murder-for-hire plot that went tragically wrong. The theory explained several key aspects of the crime. It explained why Marianne had no known connection to the attack. It explained the direct execution-style nature of the shooting. And it explained why nothing had been taken from the home. But even with all of that, there was still a problem. It was only a theory. There was no physical evidence directly linking any of these individuals to the crime scene. No witness could place them there. No forensic proof tied them to the weapon or the location. Investigators had a possible explanation, but not enough to make an arrest. Still, the idea that this was a case of mistaken identity began to take hold within the investigation. Law enforcement officials would later acknowledge that they believed this was the most likely scenario. And if that belief was true, it made the case even more disturbing, because it meant that Marianne Wilkinson had done nothing to bring danger to her door. She had simply been in the wrong place, at the wrong time. As detectives continued their work, they turned their focus towards something that could either confirm or dismantle this theory: physical evidence. Because if this was a planned act carried out by someone hired to do a job, then there had to be traces left behind. As the theory of a mistaken identity began to take shape, investigators turned their full attention to the physical evidence collected from the scene. If this had been a planned attack, then somewhere within that evidence would be the key to confirming it. The most important pieces were the shell casings recovered from the front entrance of the Wilkinson home. Each casing was carefully logged and sent for forensic analysis. Ballistics experts began examining them under magnification, comparing markings that are often as unique as fingerprints. These markings could potentially link the casings to a specific firearm, and if that firearm had ever been used in another crime, it could open an entirely new path forward. For a time, that possibility seemed promising. Investigators worked to determine the type of weapon used, narrowing it down based on the size and characteristics of the casings. The findings suggested a handgun commonly available during that period, but not rare enough to immediately point to a single owner. That meant detectives needed more, so they widened the scope. Law enforcement began checking records of registered firearms, looking for any connections to the individuals who had come under scrutiny during the mistaken identity theory. They examined ownership histories, transfers, and any reports of stolen weapons that might match the profile. At the same time, they revisited the area surrounding Spence Court. Search efforts extended into nearby wooded areas, drainage ditches, and roadside paths. Anywhere a weapon could have been discarded after the shooting. Officers combed through these locations methodically, hoping the shooter had made a mistake or acted in haste. But nothing was recovered. No firearm, no discarded clothing, no personal items left behind. It was as if the person responsible had planned not just the attack, but the escape as well. Still, investigators weren't finished. They began reconstructing the timing of the crime in even greater detail. By working backward from the moment emergency calls were placed, they attempted to build a narrow window of when the shooter arrived and left. This timeline was then compared against known movements of the individuals they were investigating. Any inconsistency could have been critical. But once again, the results were inconclusive. While some individuals could not fully account for every moment of their time, there was no definitive contradiction strong enough to place them at the scene. Suspicion remained, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. Then came another development, one that briefly reignited hope. Investigators explored whether the shell casings could be matched to any weapons previously seized or tested in other cases. If the same gun had been used elsewhere, it might already exist in evidence somewhere. This process took time. Ballistics databases were far more limited in the late 1970s, and comparisons often had to be done manually. It required patience, precision, and a bit of luck. In the end, no confirmed match was found. The casings remained isolated, connected only to the crime on Spence Court and nothing beyond it. Despite all of this, detectives believed they were close. They had a strong working theory, they had individuals of interest, and they had a crime scene that pointed clearly to a targeted act. But what they didn't have was the one thing that could bring it all together: proof. Without a weapon, without eyewitness identification, and without forensic evidence tying a suspect directly to the scene, the case stalled. Leads were followed, interviews were conducted, and pressure was applied. But nothing crossed the threshold needed to move forward with charges. What made it even more frustrating was how close it all seemed. The answers felt just within reach, yet every path ended the same way, with questions that couldn't be fully resolved. As time passed, the investigation began to slow. By this point in the investigation, detectives were no longer asking what had happened on Spence Court. They were focused on who could be responsible. The mistaken identity theory had introduced a possible explanation. Now attention turned to the individuals connected to it. At the center of that focus was Dennis Taylor, the estranged husband of the nearby woman who believed she had been the intended target. Investigators examined his background closely, looking for anything that could support or disprove the idea that he might have been involved in arranging an attack. The divorce between them had reportedly become increasingly hostile. There were disputes that extended beyond the personal, touching on finances, control, and shared interests. Detectives considered whether those tensions could have escalated into something far more serious, but motive alone was not enough. To move forward, investigators needed to establish whether Dennis Taylor had the means and opportunity to carry out or arrange the crime. This is where the investigation widened. Two men, Vincent Lane and Willie Boley, became key figures in the case. Their names surfaced through connections that detectives believed were worth exploring, particularly in relation to Taylor. Willie Boley, in particular, was reported to have had a working relationship with him, which immediately drew attention. Investigators began mapping out the relationships between these individuals. They conducted interviews, cross-checked statements, and looked for inconsistencies. Each conversation was an attempt to uncover something, anything, that could tie them directly to the events of that night. But the deeper they looked, the more complicated things became. No one confessed, no one placed themselves at the scene, and no witness could confirm seeing any of them near the Wilkinson home at the time of the shooting. Even so, suspicion remained. There were elements that investigators couldn't ignore, associations, timing gaps, and circumstances that didn't fully add up. At times, it seemed like the truth was just beneath the surface, just out of reach. Authorities also explored the possibility of a hired shooter. If this had been a murder-for-hire plot, it would explain the calculated nature of the attack and the lack of personal connection to Marianne Wilkinson. It would also explain the clean escape, the absence of panic, hesitation, or mistakes. But that possibility introduced a new challenge. If someone had been hired, then the person who pulled the trigger might not have had any direct ties to the victim, or even to the area. That would make identifying them significantly more difficult, especially with the limited forensic tools available at the time. The investigation reached a difficult point. Detectives had a theory that made sense. They had individuals who fit within that theory, but they still lacked the evidence needed to prove it in a court of law. And without that, the case could not move forward. Over time, the intensity of the investigation began to fade. Leads dried up. Interviews led nowhere new. The people at the center of suspicion remained just that, suspects, but never charged. For the Wilkinson family, that reality was devastating. There were answers being suggested, but not confirmed. There were names being discussed, but not held accountable. And as the case remained unresolved, it slowly began to shift into something else entirely. Not an active investigation, but a cold case. As the investigation lost momentum, the case of Marianne Wilkinson slowly began to fade from the front lines of active police work. In the months that followed the shooting, detectives continued to pursue every lead they could find. Interviews were revisited. Statements were reviewed again and again, searching for even the smallest inconsistency that might open a new direction. But each time, the results were the same, nothing definitive. The individuals who had once been at the center of suspicion remained under scrutiny for a time, but without new evidence, there was no legal path forward. Investigators could not justify charges based on theory alone, no matter how strongly they believed in it. Eventually, the case reached a difficult turning point. Resources had to be redirected. New cases demanded attention, and the investigation into Marianne Wilkinson's murder was officially scaled back. It didn't mean the case was closed, but it was no longer active in the way it once had been. It had become a cold case. As the years passed, the world around it changed. Advancements in forensic science began to transform how crimes were solved. Techniques that didn't exist in the late 1970s, such as modern DNA analysis and improved ballistic databases, started to bring answers to cases that had once seemed impossible to solve. Naturally, this raised new hope. There were periodic efforts to revisit the evidence collected from Spence Court. Investigators looked at whether anything could be re-examined using updated technology. The shell casings in particular remained one of the most important pieces of physical evidence. If they could be linked to a weapon or to another crime, it might finally create the breakthrough the case had been missing. But once again, progress was limited. The evidence, while carefully preserved, did not provide the kind of results needed to move the case forward. There was no confirmed match, no new forensic connection that could change the direction of the investigation. And so, the case remained suspended in uncertainty. For the Wilkinson family, time did not bring closure. Instead, it brought distance from the answers they had been searching for. The questions that existed in the early days of the investigation were still there, unchanged, unresolved, and increasingly difficult to answer as memories faded and details became harder to verify. Yet the case was never completely forgotten. It continued to be discussed, revisited, and examined by those who believed there was still something left to uncover. The theory of mistaken identity remained the most widely accepted explanation, but it had never been proven, and that left a gap. One that could not be filled by speculation alone. Because in the end, there was still no definitive answer to the most important question: who was responsible? As decades passed, the case stood as a reminder of how even a crime that seems close to being solved can slip just out of reach. But there was still one final piece to consider. Because sometimes, the most important part of a case like this isn't just what happened, it's what it leaves behind. By the time the case of Marianne Wilkinson's murder settled into history, it had already left something behind that no investigation could erase. Unanswered questions. From the very beginning, this was a case that seemed like it should have been solvable. There was a clear crime scene, physical evidence, and even a theory that explained how and why it may have happened. Yet despite all of that, no one was ever held accountable. And that is what continues to define this case. The idea of mistaken identity remains the most widely accepted explanation. It offers a reason for why Marianne Wilkinson, a woman with no known connection to criminal activity or personal conflict, would become the victim of such a targeted and deliberate act. But even that theory is incomplete because it relies on assumptions that were never proven. If the wrong house was targeted, then who was the intended victim? If the attack was planned, then who planned it? And if someone carried it out, how were they able to disappear without leaving a trace? These are not small gaps in the story. They are the central pieces of it. Over the years, the names that once surfaced during the investigation have remained part of the conversation. But without charges, without trials, and without definitive evidence, those names exist only in connection to suspicion, not resolution. And that distinction matters, because in the eyes of the law, the case remains open, but unsolved. For the Wilkinson family, that reality has never changed. The loss they experienced on that night was immediate, but the lack of answers has lasted far longer. Every passing year adds more distance from the truth, making it harder to recover what was never fully understood in the first place. Yet, cases like this are never completely gone. They remain in records, in conversations, and in the efforts of those who continue to believe that one detail, one overlooked piece of evidence, could still bring everything into focus. It has happened before. Cold cases, even those decades old, have been reopened and solved through new technology, renewed attention, or information that simply took time to surface. And because of that, there's always the possibility, however small, that this case could one day reach a different ending. But until that day comes, the story remains unfinished. A quiet street, a knock at the door, and a moment that changed everything. The murder of Marianne Wilkinson stands as a reminder of how fragile certainty can be, and how even the most carefully built investigations can leave behind mysteries that refuse to be solved. And sometimes, the most unsettling truth is not what we know, it's what we never will.